Valentine's Day, February 14, 1943. High above Bougainville in the Solomon Islands, at 18,000 feet, something was about to change forever. Japanese naval pilots were about to encounter a fighter aircraft that would methodically strip away their dominance across the entire Pacific theater. The machine bearing down on them was sleek and dark blue, with those distinctive inverted gull wings that were recognizable even from miles away. What happened next would shock every experienced pilot in Japan's air service. The American fighter climbed with an almost contemptuous ease. It rose past 20,000 feet, then kept climbing, still 22,000, still ascending with power to spare. Meanwhile, the Mitsubishi Zero, the pride of Japan's naval aviation, was already straining at its absolute limit. This newcomer was the Vought F-4U Corsair, though flyers would soon call it something else entirely. When it dove, the oil coolers mounted in the wing roots produced a distinctive whistling wail that pilots would remember for the rest of their lives. They'd call it whistling death. Within just 18 months, this single aircraft type would shatter something far more fragile than metal and engines. It would break the spirit of Japan's most elite fighter pilots. Those carefully honed tactics that had worked so brilliantly since 1937. Obsolete. The confidence that had carried them through years of combat. Gone. What started on that Valentine's Day was the beginning of a systematic dismantling. Japanese pilots went from being the hunters to becoming the hunted. When they spotted those distinctive inverted wings, they stopped looking for victory. They started thinking about whether they'd survive to fly another day. To really understand the psychological devastation the Corsair inflicted, you have to first grasp just how supremely confident Japanese naval aviators actually were in early 1943. These weren't average pilots. These were survivors of one of the most rigorous selection processes aviation had ever seen. The Yokoren Naval Aviator Preparatory Course rejected more than 98% of everyone who applied. The training itself was merciless. Over 3 years, more candidates died during training than America lost in some entire battles. By the time 1943 arrived, the average Japanese carrier pilot had logged more than 800 hours in the air. Veterans from the China campaigns often had double that, 2,000 hours or more. They'd revolutionized naval warfare at Pearl Harbor. They'd shocked the British at Salerno. They'd dominated the skies from Burma all the way to the Gilbert Islands. In 1942, the Zero had achieved a kill ratio of 12-1 against Allied fighters. Japanese pilots had perfected energy tactics that exploited everything their aircraft could do. The unmatched maneuverability, the exceptional range, the visibility that let them see threats from farther away than anyone else. A Zero could turn tighter than any Allied fighter it faced. It could fly farther. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it seemed genuinely unbeatable. Japan's naval fighter doctrine, refined through 6 years of combat starting in China, emphasized individual skill and aggressive action. Pilots were taught that spiritual superiority, Bushido, the warrior's code, would overcome any material disadvantage. And it had worked. Against Chinese pilots, against British Hurricanes, against American P-40s and Wildcats. Every victory reinforced the belief that skill and spirit trumped hardware and protection. When the Corsair first appeared in the Solomon Islands, Japanese commanders initially dismissed it as just another clumsy American attempt to match the Zero through brute force and horsepower. Marine Fighting Squadron 124 arrived at Guadalcanal on February 12, 1943, bringing the first 12 F-4U Corsairs. Japanese reconnaissance spotted them immediately. The inverted gull wing configuration was unmistakable. The massive four-bladed propeller was unlike anything in the Zero's tradition. The nose extended unusually far forward of the cockpit, giving the whole airframe an alien appearance. The first real combat came just 2 days later, Valentine's Day. Corsairs were escorting PB-4Y Liberators on a strike against Kahili Airfield on Bougainville. What followed was initially disastrous for the Americans. 9 Allied aircraft went down. Only 1 Zero was destroyed. But something crucial emerged from that engagement, something that would haunt every Japanese pilot who witnessed it. These new fighters performed in ways that fundamentally contradicted everything they'd learned. The Corsairs didn't fight the way American fighters were supposed to fight. They didn't try to turn with the Zeros. Instead, they climbed, something no American fighter had ever managed to do successfully against the Zero. And then they dived. They dived at speeds the Zeros simply couldn't match. The Corsairs would use that speed advantage to break away. Then zoom climb back up to altitude, completely untouchable. Zeros couldn't follow, Zeros couldn't escape, Zeros couldn't force the close-range fight where their maneuverability meant something. When Japanese intelligence officers began assembling the technical data on the F-4U Corsair, what they discovered was overwhelming. The disparity wasn't just concerning, it represented an entirely different category of aircraft. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine produced 2,000 horsepower at takeoff. With water injection engaged during combat, it could hit 2,250 horsepower. The Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine managed 1,130 horsepower. This wasn't just a power advantage, it was a different world. Maximum speed told the story clearly. A Corsair could reach 417 miles per hour at 19,900 feet. The latest Zero model available in 1943 could barely push 351 miles per hour. In a dive, the difference became absolutely terrifying. Corsairs routinely exceeded 500 miles per hour while remaining fully controllable. Zeros experienced dangerous flutter at 360 miles per hour. Above 410, the airframe started coming apart. The climb rates were equally sobering for Japanese pilots. A Corsair could reach 20,000 feet in just 7.7 minutes. With a standard climb rate of 2,190 feet per minute, or 3,210 feet per minute when the pilot applied water injection emergency power. A Zero needed 11 minutes to reach that same altitude. Above 25,000 feet, where the Corsair remained powerful and responsive, the Zero became sluggish and barely controllable. The American fighter's service ceiling of 36,900 feet might as well have been another planet for pilots whose aircraft struggled even at 33,000 feet. The armament difference proved psychologically devastating in its own right. The Corsair carried 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns. Each fired 850 rounds per minute. Each round left the muzzle at 2,140 feet per second. Combined, these guns delivered 69 pounds of metal downrange every single second. The Zero carried 2 7.7mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons. This amounted to 13 pounds per second. The cannons carried only 60 rounds each, enough for roughly 7 seconds of firing before running dry. Japanese pilots quickly learned something far worse than simply being outgunned. The Corsair was nearly indestructible compared to the unarmored Zero. The F-4U carried 155 pounds of armor plating protecting the cockpit. The fuel tanks sealed themselves. The oil coolers had armor too. When a cannon shell that would shred a Zero hit a Corsair, the Corsair often just kept flying. Pilots would limp back to base with hundreds of bullet holes punched through their wings and fuselage, damage that would have sent a Zero spinning toward the ocean. This survivability changed everything about combat dynamics. American pilots could afford to be aggressive, even reckless sometimes, because their aircraft forgave mistakes. Japanese pilots had one chance. One mistake meant they died. Their aircraft had been designed for maximum performance through minimum weight. No armor, no self-sealing tanks, structure built down to the absolute bare minimum. That's how they achieved the legendary maneuverability. But the Corsair proved something important. American industrial capability could overcome the weight penalty. They built engines powerful enough to carry armor and still outperform unprotected fighters. They'd created aircraft that could survive equipment failures and lucky shots, luxuries Japanese pilots would never have. Rabaul became the proving ground. Japan's mightiest fortress in the Southwest Pacific, outside the home islands themselves, held concentrations of Japan's best fighter squadrons. They were there to stop the American advance. By October 1943, when Major Gregory Boyington arrived with his VMF 214 Black Sheep Squadron and their F-4U 1A Corsairs, the psychological momentum had already shifted decisively. Japanese pilots stopped talking about victory. Their conversation turned to survival. On December 17, 1943, Boyington led 31 Corsairs as combat air cover for bombers striking at Rabaul. The Japanese scrambled 40 Zeros, their best pilots flying the newest aircraft available. The Corsairs climbed to 25,000 feet, altitude where Zeros struggled to maneuver effectively. When the Japanese climbed to engage, the Americans dove straight through their formation at speeds near 450 miles per hour. Bursts of machine gun fire, then zoom climbing back to altitude where Zeros couldn't follow. The Japanese lost 11 aircraft, 2 Corsairs were damaged. The psychological terror went beyond raw performance numbers. The Corsair's distinctive sound became a weapon in itself. The oil coolers mounted in the wing roots created that unforgettable whistling shriek when the aircraft dove at high speed. Japanese pilots reported hearing this sound in their dreams, developing involuntary reactions when similar noises occurred anywhere. The appearance amplified the terror. The inverted gull wings created a predatory silhouette unlike anything else in the sky. The massive 13-foot 4-inch propeller, the largest ever fitted to a fighter, gave the whole airframe a brutal, purposeful look. The dark blue paint made the aircraft nearly invisible when diving down from above. American pilots weaponized this psychological advantage deliberately. They'd make terror dives over Japanese airfields, creating the whistling sound without even firing weapons. Boyington's Black Sheep painted shark mouths on their fuselages, enhancing that predatory image even further. Every encounter reinforced the terror. By mid-1943, Japan faced an equation with no solution. The Corsair and other advanced American fighters were killing experienced pilots faster than Japan could train replacements. Before the war, Japanese naval aviators trained for 500 to 700 hours before combat assignment. By 1943, fuel shortages and losses of training aircraft meant pilots were arriving with just 150 hours. By 1945, some new pilots had less than 40 to 60 hours of experience, barely able to handle their aircraft, much less engage experienced Corsair pilots. The psychological impact on veteran pilots was devastating beyond measure. They were being paired with novices who stood no realistic chance against Corsairs, forced to watch them die, forced to try protecting them. The traditional mentor system that had always worked in Japanese aviation simply collapsed under the weight of constant attrition. Veterans who flew against Corsairs in 1943 made predictions about what would happen when American carrier aviation deployed the next generation of fighters. Those predictions came horrifyingly true. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, F-6F Hellcats, sharing the Corsair's engine and similar performance characteristics, demonstrated exactly what those veterans had predicted. In what Americans called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, roughly 400 to 450 Japanese aircraft were destroyed against about 130 American losses. Many Japanese pilots never even saw the fighters that killed them. They were shot down by aircraft they couldn't climb to engage or outrun in a dive. The personal accounts from pilots who faced Corsairs reveal the depth of psychological transformation, from confidence to something resembling terror. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, flying with VMF 124, achieved his first Corsair victory on May 13, 1943. He'd accumulate 21 victories in the aircraft over 6 months. Walsh described typical engagements where Japanese pilots seemed essentially helpless against what the Corsair could do. He stated plainly that the Corsair made aerial combat unfair due to its overwhelming advantages in speed, climb performance, dive capability, armor, and firepower. Fighting Zeros became mechanical: climb above them, dive through their formation at speeds they couldn't match, fire, zoom, climb to safety, repeat. Lieutenant Robert Hansen's record was extraordinary: 20 Japanese aircraft destroyed in just 17 days, between January 14th and 30th, 1944, flying with VMF 215. He exploited the Corsair's advantages so effectively that when Japanese formations spotted Corsairs approaching, they would scatter immediately. As 1943 became 1944, improved Corsair variants widened the performance gap even further. The F-4U 1A introduced a bubble canopy for superior visibility, water injection for increased combat power, and improved armor protection. The F-4U 1D could carry 4,000 pounds of bombs, more load than many Japanese bombers could lift, while still outflying any Japanese fighter in existence. Japanese attempts to counter the Corsair revealed their technological desperation. The Zero Model 52 added armor and self-sealing tanks, but became so heavy it lost the maneuverability advantage without gaining survivability in return. The new Kawanishi N1KJ Shiden showed promise, but suffered from unreliable engines and complex hydraulic systems that failed constantly. Neither aircraft solved the fundamental problem. The arrival of F-4U-2 night fighter variants in 1944 added another dimension of terror entirely. Equipped with APS-4 airborne radar, these 36 specially modified Corsairs could hunt Japanese aircraft in darkness, previously Japan's only real sanctuary. The psychological impact was shattering. Being hunted in darkness by an invisible predator broke what remained of Japanese pilot confidence. The ultimate psychological defeat came when Japan adopted kamikaze tactics in late 1944. This shift from pilots seeking victory to pilots seeking only meaningful death represented complete acceptance of technological defeat. Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi, architect of the kamikaze program, privately admitted the actual reason. Conventional combat against Corsairs and Hellcats had become impossible. By late 1944, the exchange ratio had reached 15-1 in favor of American fighters. Rather than face meaningless death in hopeless combat, Japanese pilots would attempt to die with purpose, striking at American ships. American pilots flying Corsairs accumulated victories at rates that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington scored 22 of his 26 kills in these fighters within just 84 days. These remarkable tallies weren't simply the product of superior flying ability, but rather the result of overwhelming technical dominance. The Japanese understood this uncomfortable truth. Their finest pilots recognized that American aces were being created by their machines, not exclusively by their own exceptional skills. The aircraft had become more important than the pilot operating it, a stark contradiction to everything Japanese fighter doctrine had always emphasized. The Corsair represented American industrial power in its most concentrated and lethal form. Vought produced 12,571 of these fighters throughout the war, exceeding Japan's entire fighter production between 1942 and 1945 combined. Every single aircraft contained 13,000 pounds of aluminum, 1,000 pounds of steel, 18 miles of electrical wiring, and roughly 2,000 individual instruments and controls. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine alone demonstrated American industrial supremacy. Its 2,800 cubic inches of displacement, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, supercharging system, and precision manufacturing tolerances represented capabilities Japan couldn't replicate. It was technology so advanced that Japan couldn't have copied it, even with a captured example. While Japan was forced to send teenagers with minimal flight experience into battle, America was mass-producing pilots with industrial efficiency. The U.S. Navy trained 60,000 pilots during the conflict, each receiving 600 hours of instruction, including 200 hours of advanced fighter training. American pilots arrived in the Pacific having fired more ammunition during practice than most Japanese pilots fired during their entire combat careers. They studied gun camera footage, analyzed engagement reports, and continuously refined their tactical approach. Japanese pilot training, meanwhile, had deteriorated into something almost futile. New pilots were arriving with barely 100 hours of total flying time. Many had never fired their weapons in training, never practiced combat at altitude, never experienced high-speed dives. When the Corsair evolved into a fighter bomber in 1944, it brought an entirely new dimension of destructive capability. Equipped with bombs, rockets, and napalm, Corsairs could devastate airfields, shipping, and infrastructure with tremendous force. This multi-role flexibility meant Corsairs could appear anywhere, at any moment, in whatever configuration the mission required, creating both tactical terror and strategic uncertainty. Saburo Sakai, Japan's highest-ranking surviving ace with 64 confirmed kills, provided a stark assessment in his post-war writings. He explained that the moment he encountered Corsairs, he recognized the war was lost. not because of a single aircraft, but because America could manufacture these machines by the thousands, while Japan struggled simply to maintain its existing inventory. Sakai noted that fighting a Corsair meant one thing: escape. When Japanese pilots spotted those distinctive bent wings, they'd dive for the deck, climb into the clouds, do anything to avoid combat. This wasn't about cowardice, but rather rational calculation. Engaging a Corsair while flying a Zero had become a death sentence. By early 1945, the numbers painted a picture of catastrophic devastation. Corsairs achieved 2,040 aerial victories against 189 losses in air combat, a staggering 11.3 to 1 ratio. Yet these figures didn't capture the full extent of the psychological destruction. Numerous Japanese aircraft abandoned engagement without firing a shot. Many more were destroyed sitting on the ground as Corsairs swept through. Countless pilots refused to launch when Corsairs were in the area. The final blow came from simple production numbers. During 1945 alone, America manufactured 7,129 fighters of all varieties. Japan produced 114, most based on outdated designs from 1942. Corsair production by itself exceeded Japan's total aviation manufacturing. Corsair dominance shattered the core principles of Japanese military culture. The concept of Yamato spirit, the belief that unique Japanese determination could overcome material disadvantages, proved meaningless against technological superiority that was simply overwhelming. Individual pilot excellence became irrelevant when the aircraft itself possessed performance characteristics the enemy couldn't match. Even the most experienced Japanese ace in a perfectly maintained Zero had virtually no chance against an ordinary American pilot in a Corsair. This reality destroyed the philosophical basis of Japanese military training systems. The Battle of Okinawa from April through June 1945 provided the final and most comprehensive display of Corsair superiority. Marine and Navy Corsairs, operating from escort carriers and recaptured airfields, achieved complete air dominance over this final major Japanese stronghold outside the home islands. Okinawa's battle statistics revealed the scope of this superiority. Corsairs flew over 15,000 combat missions, achieved over 500 aerial victories, and delivered thousands of tons of ordnance. Japanese pilots, many with fewer than 30 hours of flight time, faced systematic annihilation. Those few who survived described engagements that lasted mere seconds, during which they never managed to aim their weapons at the Corsairs destroying them. As invasion of the home islands loomed closer, the prospect of facing thousands of Corsairs induced something close to strategic paralysis. Japanese military planners calculated that Americans could deploy more than 5,000 Corsairs from carriers and captured airfields. Japan could muster perhaps 2,000 flyable aircraft of all types, mostly obsolete designs, piloted by inexperienced aviators. Admiral Suemu Toyoda, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, subsequently acknowledged that traditional fighter engagements had become impossible. The only remaining option was concealing aircraft for suicide attacks. The Corsair had rendered conventional fighter operations obsolete for Japanese aviation. When atomic weapons ended the conflict in August 1945, they prevented Japanese pilots from experiencing this final catastrophe. Operation Olympic, the invasion of Kyushu, would have involved over 2,000 Corsairs operating from 48 carriers, plus dozens of recaptured airfields. Japanese pilots who made it through the war felt genuine relief at being spared this ultimate test. It would have meant extermination, not combat. Following the war's conclusion, occupation forces arranged for Japanese military leaders to tour American aircraft manufacturing plants. The Vought plant in Connecticut, still producing Corsairs, revealed the staggering dimensions of American industrial capacity. Single facilities were manufacturing more aircraft engines than the entirety of Japan's production. Individual American states possessed more aluminum production capability than all of Japan combined. Former Japanese naval officers walking through these production facilities finally grasped the fundamental impossibility of their wartime situation. They had challenged an advanced industrial superpower while operating with pre-industrial resources, dispatching pilots trained for individual combat against mass-produced machines of crushing superiority. Japanese aviation engineers conducted thorough studies of captured Corsairs following the war, treating them as blueprints for understanding how profoundly behind their technology had fallen. Every component, hydraulic systems, electronics, metallurgy, manufacturing methods, demonstrated advancement Japan hadn't conceived possible. The Corsair's influence appeared throughout every post-war Japanese aircraft design. The knowledge gained from examining the fighter that had terrorized their predecessors shaped Japan's aerospace industry for decades to come. American Corsair pilots harbored conflicted feelings regarding their overwhelming superiority. Many experienced combat as something closer to execution than warfare, particularly during 1945 when opposed by teenage Japanese pilots in antiquated aircraft. The Corsair transformed air combat into an industrial production process. American pilots weren't romantic warriors dueling in the heavens. They were technicians manipulating superior machinery against opponents who clung to warrior traditions. The Japanese never abandoned their warrior code, yet they confronted the inescapable reality of swords-facing machine guns. Corsair dominance prompted fundamental transformations in post-war Japanese society. The absolute failure of spiritual conviction against American technological advancement helped eliminate militaristic thinking and catalyzed acceptance of modernization and industrialization. The F-4U Corsair proved directly and personally to thousands of Japanese that their entire philosophical framework was mistaken. Spirit cannot overcome technology. Determination cannot defeat industrial capacity. Bravery means nothing facing overwhelming mechanical superiority. The experience of Japanese pilots encountering the F-4U Corsair represents ultimately a story of technological inevitability, inscribed in blood. Industrial warfare demonstrates that production capacity overwhelms warrior philosophy. Engineering dominates courage. The Corsair didn't merely eliminate Japanese aircraft, it destroyed an entire military worldview. Every Japanese pilot who faced it and survived carried one message: we cannot match this, we cannot prevent this. The cumulative effect of these individual encounters produced collective realization, transcending mere military loss to become societal transformation. Former confidence became absolute terror, tactical adaptation gave way to desperation, and ultimately the only option remaining was sacrificial attacks. Each confrontation with the bent-wing fighter eliminated another illusion until naked reality remained. Japan had opposed an industrial superpower with warrior spirit and suffered complete defeat. Today, restored Corsairs display at aviation shows worldwide, their distinctive sound still triggering memories among those who knew it as the whistle of death approaching. For those who encountered them in battle, the Corsair represented something far deeper: a harsh instructor, a shattering of illusions, proof that contemporary warfare rewards superior factories over superior courage. Japanese pilots feared the F-4U Corsair not from weakness, but from clear understanding. They recognized they faced not merely a superior machine, but overwhelming civilizational advantage. Their fear reflected wisdom, the terrible understanding that everything you believed proved wrong, and your death would only demonstrate your enemy's advantages. Ultimately, the Corsair accomplished what no propaganda could achieve. It made Japanese pilots afraid to fight. Within that fear existed the foundation for Japan's evolution from militaristic power to peaceful economic nation. A transformation purchased through the sacrifices of pilots who discovered too late that in modern warfare, bravery alone possesses no value when your adversary dominates the air.